The Y Curve with Phil Dobby and Roger Hearing.
Who decides who businesses have as their customers?
Well, they decide, obviously. I mean, you can't force companies to deal with people they don't like.
Yes, but what if that decision's racist or sexist or homophobic, or they just don't like their politics? I mean, is that acceptable?
That's at the core of the row between Nigel Farage and NatWest, a row that's already cost 2 senior executive their jobs and could bring about a change in the law.
So where does prudent business practice end and unfair discrimination begin? That's our subject.
This week on The Y Curve, brought to you by Wigmore Associates.
The Y Curve.
So, being debanked.
Yes.
That's what they're calling it.
Which is what we're talking about, really.
Yeah. So I would be quite happy when I came to this country. I would be quite happy being debanked because I couldn't actually be banked. Because when you come to Britain and you haven't got a credit rating because you've been living overseas,
you're a non-person.
You're a non-person, which is what Nigel Farage was very concerned about. So I feel for him because I've been a non-person because I didn't have that address that you need for a bank account, and you can't get an address because you have to have a bank account to be able to pay to get your deposit.
It's one of those nightmares. But what you don't have is his politics, and that it was at the core of all this, really.
Yeah.
As he claimed, and then the BBC and others denied, and it turned out that it was indeed the case. So it was to do with the fact that they didn't want to have someone with his political profile.
Yeah.
Which is a bit odd, though, isn't it?
Well, it is a bit odd, because you're thinking people who've got money in Coutts. I mean, I'm sure, and I've got to be very careful what I say here, but I'm sure if you... Well, let's just take a bank, which is... Oh, fuck, why is that?
What's this?
Okay, it's recording away in here. I'll just won't worry about it.
Is it not recording?
It is recording. It's not recording as I expected it to on here, but it's all right. I'm getting it on.
Do you want to start again?
No, I've got it all on here. It's all okay. I just need to dub it over. So I have to be very careful what I'm saying here. But I mean, you take, maybe not Coutts, but you take a bank with lots of people with lots of money. There's going to be question marks, aren't there?
Well, you don't know
where
what
does
they
that
think,
money come from? Where
does the money come from? What is the affiliation of the people who have the money?
Yeah.
What are their outlooks? But is that any business of the bank? That's what it really comes down to.
An ethical bank. So, I mean, is this a question of a bank with ethics? And then if you go down that road, whose ethics?
Well,
and that is the big problem about ethics generally. I mean, what you believe is ethical might be completely opposite to somebody else.
Yeah,
so.
and is it any business of a business you're dealing with? Because in the end, if it's a commercial relationship, I mean, there's an interesting area called PEPs, politically exposed persons, that banks are supposed to. We will hear about this from Aine in a bit. This is something they've got to look at. They're told, particularly to do with foreigners who have bank accounts, you have to look and examine politically exposed persons in case they are, I don't know, dictators of major countries or whatever it is. But applying that within Britain, I don't know. It gives worries, not because, I mean, Nigel Farage, many people disagree with him, but if it applies to one side of the political divide, I guess it applies to the other.
There's also, I mean, if you take it, they extrapolate it and apply it to any other business, though. I mean, surely you have to have some ability to choose who you do business with. And Nigel Farage, I mean, he is milking it a bit. I mean, he wants the whole board of NatWest to resign now. And this idea about, he felt like a non-person. I mean, really, Nigel Farage...
Well, you just said that when you don't have a bank account, that is how it feels.
Yeah, but he didn't have a Coutts bank account. He could have had a NatWest bank account. He just didn't have a bank account for the elite. So he obviously felt like he wasn't part of the elite anymore. And how much of it gets down to that, really? But anyway, and then there's all sorts of other cases. I mean, no doubt we'll bring up today that Christian cake shop in Belfast years ago. Because that went to court.
Yes.
Ultimately, they lost.
Yes, they didn't want to provide a cake for a same-sex wedding. That's essentially what it came down to.
Support gay marriage is actually what was asked to be put on the cake. And that went to the Human Rights Court in the European Court of Human Rights. So it went right to the, as far as it can go.
But it does go the other way. Gina Miller, famous campaigner during the Brexit campaign, who was trying to get Britain to prevent Brexit effectively, she had a small political party. Again, the bank didn't want to have her on their lists and got rid of her. So it's a principle rather than, I think, a particular political line.
Well, okay, now, if business ethics are important to you, then you want to do business with Wigmore Associates. No doubt about that. They are a boutique wealth management company who can look after your investments, your assets, and your pension. They'll do their best to ensure you're getting the best return, the return you deserve, so there's more money for your future and your children's future, and that you're not paying more than you have to the tax man. They'll help you choose the the right balance for your portfolio, depending on your long and short-term plans, you can contact them at Wigmore Associates, Wigmore hyphen, don't forget the hyphen.
Get the hyphen in.
Wigmore-associates.co.uk. Their email is on that website too, or you can give them a call. 020-7224-3400, 020-7224-3400.
And tell them that
we sent you.
Because
Phil and Roger sent you.
They help make the podcast
Yeah, and
possible.
they won't discriminate against you on that basis.
Absolutely not. But let's talk about that whole issue. We can bring in now someone who knows the legal issues around this, how it works, how it doesn't, and perhaps how it should. And she's Dr. Aine Clancy, who's a lecturer at the School of Law and Social Justice at the University of Liverpool, and she joins us now.
Welcome to the Y-Curve, Aine.
Aine, let me ask you, as a sort of top of the line question, is it permissible, is it legal for businesses, whether it's banks or any others, to simply refuse a customer to do business with somebody on any basis they like? Does it have to be commercial, or can it be ideological or anything else?
The short answer is it's somewhat unresolved. In UK law, businesses are prohibited from denying services to individuals where it is a breach of the Equality Act. So there are 9 protected grounds under the Equality Act, and they include things like age, gender, disability status, and interestingly, for our purposes, religious ideology or philosophical reasons. But whether being pro or anti-Brexit or any of the other reasons.
It's a religion.
That word.
It's not really real. It's kind of a religion for some,
you could
maybe.
say it's a philosophical. I mean, it has been taken as a philosophical divide, isn't it? And it's crazy to call it that, of course, but I mean, it does show that there's a grey area in all of this, doesn't there? And what about also in terms of sexual orientation? Because we had that case of Gareth Lee in Belfast, who asked that Christian-run bakery to have the slogan "Support Gay Marriage" on their cake. They actually, I mean, that was taken right to the European Court of Human Rights, wasn't it? And the bakery won that case, even though you would have thought that would be a clear-cut case of being refused based on sexual orientation.
Sure. Now, it's worth noting that for banking purposes, the situation is ever so slightly different. The payment accounts regulations specifically provide that banks must allow customers to have access to basic banking services as a condition of that bank's ongoing licensing. And those regulations, interestingly, specifically do say that banks may not discriminate on the basis of political beliefs. So I think that would be something that falls far more into the basket of which Mr. Farage was complaining.
So the law is already very clear on that from what you're saying?
For banking, yes, it seems so.
So it's a clear case then. They haven't got a leg to stand on then, have they?
It seems not.
Even though they are a bank which is quite exclusive, let's put it that way. I mean, I was explaining this to my mother-in-law who's visiting over from Australia at the moment. She didn't know she vaguely knew who Nigel Farage was, didn't know anything about Coutts Bank, and I was explaining, I said, well, you've got to earn $1 million to open an account in this bank. And she said, well, they shouldn't be allowed to do that. She had a problem with the fact that Coutts was saying you had
they were exclusive.
They were exclusive. And,
but you can be exclusive on business grounds. I mean, that's pretty clear, isn't it, Aine?
That's precisely correct. So there are 9 banks, I believe, in the UK, the 9 largest banks, who are compelled to offer basic banking services to everyone who wants them. And when I say basic, I mean a current account into which people's salaries can be paid, or social welfare payments can be paid, and who will be able to withdraw cash when there is cash in there. There's no obligation to provide any of the ancillary services that you might ordinarily have with a bank account, including, for example, access to loan funds, access to an overdraft facility or anything like that.
Now, I'm sure one of those 9 banks is NatWest, though, isn't it? So Nigel Farage was offered an account at NatWest.
That's exactly correct.
So to be very specific, there is a right to be banked as a citizen of the UK. Would that be correct?
There is a general right to basic banking services. And I think the key word here is basic. So my understanding of the Coutts accounts, well, first of all, as you pointed out, they're well within their rights to refuse to offer him an account on commercial grounds, if that's indeed what their argument was. But to the extent that he wants anything other than the basic banking services, he's really not entitled to that.
So he managed to get hold of this 40-page document, which basically called him xenophobic and racist. I mean, it was an internal document on the part of the bank, but I guess it becomes proof for what you're talking about. But so he wants to take action. He wants to take it further. I mean, doesn't this set some sort of precedent, though? If you've got a document which is developed for internal use, then gets exposed externally, I mean, it's like someone's writing something in their diary and then you take action against it because you've said something. But that's
true in lots of areas. If you've got the actual evidence of a particular set of circumstances or thoughts of an internal document, that is evidence in a criminal case, potentially.
Yes, I mean, the interesting thing that will come of this, or the potential interesting outcome from this service access request that Mr. Farage has made, which he's completely entitled to in any organisation which holds personal data about an individual, they're entitled to make a subject access request about what documentation is held on them. But it will be interesting to see what impact this has on what banks are willing to record in their internal documentation going forward, where they're making decisions like this, and whether perhaps banking committees might end up being a little more self-censoring than they otherwise would be when they're having these kinds of discussions.
But banks do have to protect themselves if they've got concerns about people who, so if you've got a lot of money in your bank account that's come from, an unusual path to get to you, if they suspect money laundering, for example, even if they just suspect it, I mean, don't they have the right to say, well, okay, this account is now too risky for us. We can't prove the case, but we just don't want to take the risk.
We're not suggesting, by the way, that Nigel Farage has that kind of money.
No, not at all. No, I mean, I didn't even mention him in the sentence. But I mean, it's because banks are obviously all about risk and risk mitigation, and you've got to give them the ability, if they just have a concern, even if they can't prove it, to say, well, yeah, we're not prepared to take that risk just in case.
Yes, that's exactly correct. And this is reflected in the rules that apply to banks, and reflected in the fact that Mr. Farage and all other politicians and all close associates of politicians and their family members are regarded as being potentially politically exposed to high risks of bribery or other forms of graft. And consequently, banks are required to apply what's known as enhanced due diligence against the operations of the accounts of politically exposed persons.
Yeah, now, that PEP is a very specific legal category, isn't it?
That's exactly correct. Now, banks do have some latitude in to whom they continue to apply PEP designation to. For example, under the English anti-laundering regulations, banks are required to continue to apply enhanced due diligence, enhanced levels of oversight to the bank accounts of PEPs for 1 year after they leave office. And if they choose to, and if they suspect that someone is particularly high risk, then they can continue to apply enhanced due diligence against that person for as long as they wish to thereafter.
But could they say, well, this person is particularly high risk for the reasons you said, so we actually don't want to have them associated with our brand or be part of our business model, and we won't bank them? Is that legal?
It is legal insofar as the bank wishes to take a commercial decision to de-risk themselves, but they'll still be required under the payments accounts regulations to provide basic banking services to that customer who's a PEP.
Right, which with their argument would be, well, we're doing that with NatWest, not with Coutts.
Yeah,
that's correct. Yes.
So overall, I mean, just drawing the threads together with this, it does look as if the bank, NatWest in this case, have behaved much against the regulations as specified. But as we said, they did offer another account. And there is a regulation that insists that everybody has entitled to basic banking services. But as a general principle about how you deal with customers, first of all, it seems quite strange in a way that banks need to think that hard about the political colour of the people they're dealing with. I mean, the words woke and all that, I suppose, hang around that. But also, is it something that's happening more and more, that there is this kind of political idea about how you should or shouldn't deal with people in what are purely commercial circumstances?
I think the banking regulators and the banks themselves would say that it's not political per se, that it's nothing personal, that they're merely applying the extra layers of caution that's required by them under the money laundering regulations when dealing with PEPs. So that's kind of an important point to note. And it should be noted too that banks in the UK have been subject to very substantial fines from the Financial Conduct Authority over the past decade or so as a result of failing to properly apply and properly maintain anti-money laundering standards. And those anti-money laundering standards include ensuring that you apply and proceed with particular caution in the case of PEPs, politically exposed persons. So that's their argument. What we're seeing in practice, however, is anecdotally, at least, it's very difficult to put any kind of meaningful number on the numbers of banks that are involved in this, or the number of customer accounts that are involved in this. But because banks are so wary of falling foul of these anti-money laundering regulations and attracting these significant fines, there now seems to be a tendency in some cases for them to proceed with too much caution. So where a PEP or a PEP's family member approaches a bank and says that they wish to open a bank account, often the bank will come up with a reason, or perhaps not even give a reason, as to why they're unwilling to allow that customer to be a client of their bank. And the outcome of that is that anecdotally, we're now seeing huge problems with PEPs and their family members becoming debanked or unbanked because banks are unwilling to potentially fall foul of the anti-money laundering regulations and or are unwilling to incur the expense of imposing additional oversight over these individuals' bank accounts.
For the enhanced services that you talked about, I mean, for basic services, they'd still be able to, but it's the enhanced services where if they've got a lot of money, then it's creating wealth from that money, which would be the services that those people would be interested in, which is why you'd be with Coutts in the first place. But it seems to me as though, and I hate to say this, I hate to side with Nigel Farage, generally as a principle in life, but it does seem like, he has a strong case here, doesn't it? Because, okay, they may see he's a politically exposed person.
No, he doesn't hold office at the moment.
But he's in the public eye, very much so. And he's a man who's known to have an agenda. No mention of money laundering or any implications of that anywhere along the line. But obviously they've wanted to do their due diligence. They got a lot of people together to compile this 40-page document on him. But it seems like the focus of that document is not about whether he's involved in money laundering. It's calling him a xenophobic, a racist. It's looking at, for example, how he supported or retweeted a tweet from Ricky Gervais, which somebody within the bank obviously saw was politically insensitive. It's sort of like, I don't know, it is, and I hate to use the word wokedom as well, but it's like a bunch of people in the bank are pursuing some sort of woke agenda against him.
But where is the advantage for the bank in this? That's the hard thing to see in a way, because if this hadn't happened, no one would have said, we're not going to work with NatWest anymore because Nigel Farage is on their books.
It's a bit like saying we want to get rid of you because we don't like you very much. That's what it amounts to, doesn't it?
I wonder this myself. I don't see what the upside was. No one was aware of the fact that Mr. Farage was banking with Coutts at all until they essentially debanked him. And it's worth noting as well that with the past few decades, where we've seen, for example, Swiss banks involved in quite significant political scandals whereby they've allowed cash stolen from the coffers of developing world countries, and subsequently that's been publicised. In none of those situations where it subsequently transpired that those Swiss banks had facilitated money laundering and graft, was there any suggestion that customers started walking away from those banks for that reason? So it's confusing to me why Coutts has taken this line. I suppose on some level, because they're not subject to the requirement to provide basic accounts services, because they are not one of the 9 large banks, they're a subsidiary of them, then they are entitled to exercise discretion on the grounds of whatever reason they wish. But on the other hand, it's very difficult to see what the upside for Coutts was in making this decision.
And one of the issues at the heart of this is also privacy, and banking privacy is a sort of principle. And in fact, one of the complaints that Nigel Farage had was that his privacy was compromised, and that normally means banks don't go around saying, we're a great bank, look at our list of customers, because people don't want to be known to be.
Wasn't his privacy compromised because he got them to release a document all about him? I mean,
No. I think the point was that the head of NatWest had actually talked about him at some gathering and his banking arrangements, because privacy, Aine, surely is, if it's not a legal duty, it's certainly a customary duty of banks, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And I suspect, and we don't have any real insight into why the head of NatWest ended up being axed from their position, but I suspect it was the failure to respect customers' privacy as much as any other reason that they eventually had to go.
So what about outside the banking world then? So if Nigel Farage came to me and said, hey, Phil, can you make a podcast for me? Because that's what I would do for a living these days. I mean, would I be in my rights to say, no, I'm not going to do that for you, Nigel, because I don't like you very much? It would be fine for me because I'm not a bank, wouldn't it?
Possibly. It depends on what basis you've decided not to represent him. This issue is quite a current issue of debate in legal services being provided to individuals who might not necessarily have the best of intentions in entering into legal cases. And I'm specifically talking here, particularly pre the invasion of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, of the tendency of Russian oligarchs to weaponize the courts in London to intimidate or chill or silence particular journalists, for example, Tom Burgess or Catherine Belton, both of whom...
Yeah, these are what they call the slaps, I think, isn't that the term?
Right, yes. So some commentators have pointed to the fact that some law firms don't seem to have any big problem with representing oligarchs in those situations, even though those cases represent what is probably an abuse and a weaponization of the English legal system. In those cases, it's very difficult to see an ethical case against turning down those individuals. So if you don't like their intention or if you don't like their politics, there should be no reason in principle why you shouldn't be able to turn down their business.
But in law, maybe that's, I mean, wouldn't law be the same as banking?
Well, I think it's different because isn't there a tradition, if it's only traditional, perhaps you're right, it's almost like the taxi rank. Legal firms have to pretty much take the next one that comes along. They can't make judgments. Isn't that part of it?
Whether they believe they're guilty or not.
Yeah, exactly.
No, there's absolutely no requirement. Obviously, they are prohibited from, and it is a different situation in the case of barristers, but I'm talking about solicitors' firms in particular, provided that they are not falling foul of the Equality Act. There's nothing in principle from their turning down potential clients. And it's worth noting as well that some of the solicitors' firms who've been embroiled in this controversy have said, well, you know, these oligarchs have a right of access to the courts just like anyone else who falls within the jurisdiction of these cases, and therefore it would be remiss of us not to represent them. But the counter argument made by many clients, many civil society organisations there is, well, if that's the case, and if you feel so strongly about their right of access to the courts, you don't have to take on their mega fees. You can just do
it pro bono, perhaps.
Take them on at that rate, exactly.
Well, that's not going to happen. I mean, when you say this is a debate, is there potential then for some change in the regulations in regard to this, or some alteration of the rules? Is there an appetite within the legal community for that?
It depends who you're asking. There doesn't seem to be a strong appetite from law firms. It's not something that the Law Society has come out strongly on one way or another. The government is currently developing rules around SLAPs with a view to making...
We should just say what SLAP stands for. I said we throw this term around. So it's to do with trying to suppress comment. But do you know what the actual initials stand for?
It stands for Strategic Lawsuits Against Public Participation. And the idea behind them really, or one of the primary drivers behind initiating those strategic lawsuits, is to silence or chill critics rather than to meaningfully seek recompense because your name, in your view, or your reputation was sullied in the press or by a particular author.
So beyond all of this, I mean, it's the case is, because it's muddy, isn't it? It's all very muddy. But it's pretty clear when it comes to gender, race, age, sexual orientation.
Well, is it clear unless you specify it? You'd have to prove that the reason I don't want to do business with you is for this reason, and that you can't see into someone's mind, I suppose, and detect what is the actual reason.
And obviously very difficult to prove as well, because if you don't want to do business with someone, you just go, I'm a bit busy at the moment.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Although, once again, if you're a bank, you can't do that if someone is seeking basic bank account services.
But as a business, if you're not a bank where these regulations don't apply, in general, unless you can absolutely prove that the reason you won't do business with me is one of these categories, then actually people are perfectly at liberty to choose their customers.
That's correct, yes.
But I mean, but where do you draw the line on all of that? Because if it is a subsection of society and you say, you quickly get into the road of, if you can't get on a bus or you can't eat in particular restaurants.
Well, that's what I'm thinking. It would be very difficult.
You're sort of getting then back to, South Africa in the 80s, aren't you?
Yeah, and you might know, Anya, that shop will not serve people who are black, for example. I mean, imagine.
Well, I suppose if you had a situation where you had a shop where you knew that they would not serve people who were black, and you were able, I suppose, in some way to evidence that this seemed to be systemic, then there would be scope, perhaps, to bring a case against them under the equality legislation for discrimination on the grounds of race.
But it'd be quite a hard thing to prove, I want to imagine. It might be very obvious to everybody, but it would be, in terms of legal proof, it's quite a high bar, isn't it?
That's absolutely correct. And more generally, the stress, the energy, the cost of initiating a case in that respect means that we are probably seeing an enormous amount of discrimination-based cases throughout the UK on a daily basis, and nothing really has been done about it unless you have the appetite and the resources at your disposal to pursue people on an equality claim.
But if it's none of those things, and it is, I get back to the case, if you just don't like someone,
yeah, I mean, that's legal.
And that should be the case, shouldn't it? I mean, if you're running a business, you should be able to choose who you do business with. It's like like Donald Trump is having difficulty defending himself because he's not getting lawyers, because lawyers are refusing to work with him.
Yes.
Should he be able to insist?
Well, American law, I guess, may be different.
There are a couple of things at play here. First of all, Mr. Trump is a special case because the particular kinds of lawyers that he is seeking to represent him are the creme de la creme. They will be lawyers who charge incredibly high amounts. They will be incredibly specialized in their area. No one is suggesting that Mr. Trump is being denied legal representation outright. I'm sure he can avail of the federal legal aid appointed lawyer if he wishes to. So I don't think that that case really stands up in Mr. Trump's case. It's not like he's being denied access to legal services or access to court outright. It's more he's being denied access to his preferred lawyers because they don't want to work with him.
He can certainly pay for it, for sure. And I suppose drawing that to the UK then, Anya, if someone who has a terrible reputation wants to be represented in court, perhaps on a civil case as opposed to a criminal one, must a solicitor be found to represent him or her, or is there no actual right to be represented? Could a solicitor just say, would all solicitors say, no, we're not going to touch that?
There is a right to be represented in criminal trials, and therefore, I'm not strong on what the particular rules around legal aid solicitors and their requirements.
But beyond legal aid, I mean, if you've got bags of cash and you want to get the best, and the best say, well, I don't want to represent you, is that perfectly acceptable?
They're absolutely within their rights to turn someone down because they don't agree with their political views, for example.
So that form of discrimination can exist in the legal area. To some extent, it can exist in the banking area, and more generally, commercially, the capacity to turn down people you don't like is considerable.
So it sounds like the law is a bit woolly on all of this, but I guess it has to be because, I mean, how do you define how do you create something that is very definitive? Because there's so many moving parts to it.
Yeah, and there is a need for equity in this, a need for fairness.
There is, and that's presumably why the banking rules are different from any other rules when it comes down to turning someone down or not being able to turn someone down for basic bank account provision on the basis of their political views. The difference there, especially in an increasingly cashless society, is that it is more or less, or increasingly at least, very difficult to exist in society without basic banking services. Probably you can exist in society without hiring the creme de la creme lawyers of your choice, if you can afford them, and you can instead just opt for, in criminal cases, for example, those provided by the Legal Aid Board.
So what changes as a result of this whole Nigel Farage episode? I mean, does the law need to be refined in a particular way? Are there repercussions coming from this?
We're already seeing anecdotal evidence of repercussions. So there are, the FT this weekend, the Financial Times reported on a Facebook group of various individuals, including family members of PEPs. The Facebook group in question now has apparently 6,000 members, all of whom are swapping tips on how to get the subject access requests, apply for them, successfully get them. Of the same kind as the 40-page document that Mr. Farage successfully applied to from Coutts.
So there's more of this to come.
So that they, in turn, can find evidence which will allow them to dispute banks' decisions to debank them or to cut down on the number of services available to those particular individuals. So that's the first thing. And it's worth noting, too, that the Cities Minister has written to the Financial Conduct Authority and has urged it to expedite a planned review that it was going to undertake anyway into how banks deal with the bank accounts of PEPs more generally. So this has sparked a lot of discussion around banks being perhaps too ready to withdraw or refuse banking services to PEPs.
And that may change, and it'll be interesting to see if it does and what the consequences are. Aine, thanks very much indeed for being with us. Very interesting area of where change could be around the corner for political reasons, but perhaps applying on both sides of the political boundary.
Yeah, Nigel Farage driving change again. Thanks, Anya.
Take care.
It's been a real pleasure. Thanks both. Bye.
So anyway, Nigel Farage is never going to come to me and ask if he can have my business.
No, but he's not. He's not going to bank with you, that's for sure.
No, for sure. And I'm quite happy with my bank. I'd like to point that out. So don't debank me.
Well, you've got to find out what they think of you. You've got to send off for this report. Yeah. Internal report.
I don't think I quite got the profile.
Phil Dobby.
Who, what?
Dodgy politics.
Yeah, maybe. Now look, next week.
Talking of dodgy politics.
Yes. Yeah. Well, no, we're not dodgy politics.
Well, some would say.
We're going to talk about the Tory party, Roger?
Well, I rest my
That's
case,
not dodgy
frankly.
politics.
Well, we're in a situation where the Conservatives, I mean, every day you hear tales of woe, people standing down, not going to stand again. The Tories clearly feel they're going for a wipeout next year. That's what's going to happen.
It seems like desperation politics right now, doesn't it, from Rishi? I mean, the glimmer of hope that they had, that they narrowly won that by-election in Boris Johnson's old seat, and it was because, of the ULEZ. And so now all of a sudden, well, what else can we do
let's put lots of drilling into the North Sea.
Yeah, exactly. All of a sudden, let's forget the whole
drill,
green
baby,
agenda.
drill. Yes. Yeah. So it does suggest an element of desperation, but I suppose it'd be interesting to find out, does the Tory party have much hope? Are they consigned to the wilderness? How bad a wilderness is it likely to be? What could happen? Because we've probably got 12 months before an election, maybe more.
God help us. Yeah, and whenever we hear this talk about, a particular party, 10 years in the wilderness. I mean, people were saying that about the Labour Party a few years ago, weren't they? And all of a sudden, things seem to turn around fairly quickly.
That is the question we will address. What hope for the Tories?
Yeah, next week on The Y Curve, brought to you by Wigmore Associates. We'll see you then.
Bye.
The Y Curve.